I was not looking for a relationship when I met Philip Dodd. I was not. My husband and I, at the time, went through a divorce. That was very, very devastating to me, realizing that I made a mess of something. Philip and I met in 2005, and I met him working at a long-term care facility. I was a registered nurse, and he was a licensed practical nurse, and I admired his practices as a nurse. Very competent, very caring. He also told me he had 2 children living with him that he had custody of, and that he took them to church. I thought, my gosh, it was almost like he was too good to be true. Philip was my first relationship after the divorce, and when I brought him to meet my family, I was so proud. I knew they were going to be impressed. I knew they would see what I saw. And I was showing him off to my family and gaining their acceptance and approval. When we were there, Philip seemed to be blending in fine with them. I saw him visiting with everybody. It seemed to be a good mood. I was thrilled. I thought he was getting along with everyone, but I was mistaken. After the family get-together, my brother said, hey, I wanted to let you know something. He said, you know, we really weren't impressed by Philip. He said, Mom really wasn't. And I was confused. It did not portray that way to me. And I specifically asked him, what did Philip do or say that made you not like him or offended by him? He said, sis, I just felt he was a bad person. Very shocking, very shocking. That's complete opposite of what I thought. And he said, Mom thought exactly the same. And I said, did he say something? And he said, no, we just got that vibe from him. There was something wrong. I stayed with Philip because I didn't see what everybody else saw. I thought, maybe this one time my family's wrong. I've been diabetic since I was 19, requiring insulin and frequent blood glucose checks. I believe with his nursing background, Philip wanted to care for me. He wanted to be checking to see if my blood sugar was good or if I needed to eat. He was very on top of that. It made me feel loved. It made me feel that he was very concerned and worried about me. One day, it was very odd. I became so sick, and I know my blood sugars were running high, and all I wanted to do was sleep. He appears to be taking care of me. He's checking my blood sugar, and oddly enough, he's giving me insulin. All I remember is him saying, I'm giving you some insulin. I remember nothing after that, nothing. I was in a haze the whole time I was there. I couldn't tell you remembering eating or anything. It's almost like he kept me there on purpose. In this state that I was in, it was almost as if I had been drugged. I was there, I would say at least 3 days. Looking back at that event, after everything I found out later, it's frightening to say, but I've thought about that, if he could have been taking advantage of me while I was there, unconscious for those 3 days. That does cross my mind. And to this day, I still don't want to know.
Do you think he's capable of that?
I honestly think he's capable of that, yes. But again, I saw him as this great nurse, and he was taking care of me. So I tried to overlook the bad. Philip and I, we were together 5 months before I found out I was pregnant with the twins. I was excited, but I could tell he wasn't excited. I thought he was acting differently towards me because he really didn't want the babies. And it was kind of sad. And throughout the pregnancy, I didn't have anything for a child, a baby. And it was at that time when I told him I was going to go get some furniture and some clothes and diapers. He told me absolutely not. And I specifically asked him then why I couldn't go buy anything. And he told me the twins may not make it. I was shocked. I've never heard of anyone, a spouse or partner, saying that to any female that was pregnant, that they may not make it, when there was no reason to say that. He said it was because of my health. Just a generic response, that he knew that they probably wouldn't make it. For me, seeing this side of him, it breaks my heart. It breaks my heart for my children, that he could actually feel that way and not love them. But this goes deeper. A person that can say that to me is a monster. Monster. I don't know that he was planning on doing something to me to lose the babies, but it made me even more protective over him. It did. I knew something wasn't right. My ex-husband was a police officer at the time in Carl Junction, and came up to me one day and he said, I think there's some issues you need to look into because he's not who he seems. That Philip had a past and I needed to do my research. No, this is not my Philip. This is not Philip that I know.
Be careful.
I assumed that he was just being jealous that I was having a good life and moving on without him. Even though I didn't fully believe my ex-husband, it was still in the back of my brain. That evening, I went to ask, and I said to Philip,
Okay.
my ex-husband said, I need to look at you. You know, and I just kind of laughed it off, but I was still looking. And I said, why would there be someone saying that you're a person of interest? He tensed up a little bit. He goes, I didn't do anything. He goes, the reason I am a person of interest is because when I lived in Branson West, there was a girl in Hollister I was hanging around with that he just went over to party and have sexual encounters with her, and that she didn't really want to do anything with him, so he left and doesn't know what happened after. But the next morning, she ended up deceased. It was shocking when he told me that it was actually regarding someone that had died. The thought of him doing something so horrible with as kind as he is, no, it didn't add up. And I still believe to this day, I didn't want to believe that. I continued to deny the signs and say, that's not Philip. As I'm pulling up to my house, there are patrol cars outside, state patrol cars. And I can see they've already gone in. I walk in the door. It was like a punch in the stomach for me. Officers are in there just going through my stuff, personal things of mine even. I can't explain that feeling when someone is going through your life, your house, your things. If they're gonna find something, what are they looking for exactly? I don't know. I realized the search had to do with Rebecca's murder, and realizing, yes, they're looking for clues regarding Philip and this murder. The officers had the things and left, and then it was just Philip and I in the room. I was a nervous wreck. I was very unhinged at the time, and he is just appearing very confident to me, like they're not gonna find anything. I did ask him, why are they still after you? What could be with this case that they're not finding or ruling you out? Why do they continue? And he responds like they've just got him singled out.
Did you believe him?
I partially believed him. It could happen to anyone. They could be singling him out, the wrong person. But I'm realizing at this point, something's not adding up.
Susan Sutton has been waiting 5 long years for answers to what happened to her 19-year-old daughter.
Are re-examining the evidence, are talking to witnesses, past witnesses.
Becky Sutton went missing from a Hollister home in 2003. Her 2-year-old son left behind.
It makes me angry. Angry that someone could do that to her, 19, and a 2-year-old child. I feel guilty seeing this. My heart goes out to that little boy that doesn't even have a mom. A child without a mom. How do you do that? What kind of person does that? I didn't want to believe then he had done something like that. You don't want to believe that. It's just beyond imagination. I stopped staying with Philip immediately after the police came. I tell him I'm not coming back. I will not be back. I have moved out. I think I know this person, but what if I don't? That's the way I felt with Philip. This picture is right after the twins were born. At this time, he and I were separated. I was scared, not knowing what the future held with me and them, but I was gonna make it work. They renewed me. Oh, I love those kids. Looking back, it's hard to believe they could be so tiny and helpless. And I knew I wanted to protect them with all my might. Nothing else mattered in my life right then. I had no one else to turn to but Philip Dodd. I hadn't seen anything violent from him. I didn't believe he could do something violent. And again, I got scared and thought I had to have him. And I'm sure that happens to a lot of people, getting scared of their future without, someone that's capable of working and help bringing in income. It would have been 2 or 3 weeks after the babies were born that Philip and I got back together. I just wanted to fix it. He definitely knew I was vulnerable. He definitely knew that. And I do think he took advantage of the situation. But I was hoping that he would go back to the Philip I knew and loved when I first met him. So caring and confident. We were over by this wedding place where you can walk in and walk out and get married. He's like, hey, you want to get married? It came up off the cuff. I had shorts on and tennis shoes, and I'll have to admit, that did seem romantic, him being spontaneous like that. Yes, that got my attention. That would be the man that I fell in love with, yes. It's okay, let's do it. And we walked in there and got married. I was full of hope. This was the wedding ring Philip gave me. It meant so much to me. I've kept it all these years. I don't know why. I lived a nightmare with him, but this represents my dreams I had with him. I actually was in love with him at a time, a long time ago. So one day, I was in the passenger seat, Philip was driving, the twins were in the middle seat, and his kids were in the seat back behind there, both of his boys. I found out Philip had some severe money problems. It appeared it was all related to his gambling addiction. I make a comment offhand, he angers like that. I had never seen him that angry. I had seen him angry, but I'd never seen him like this. And I looked into his eyes. I didn't know who he was. The next thing I know, he's reached over from the driver's seat. He's got his hands around me, choking me. I thought, what do I do? I'd never had anyone choke me, so I didn't know what to do. You just automatically grab and try to get their hands off of you and crying out, please, please don't do this in front of these kids. I was screaming, get off of me. Please leave me alone. I was crying And finally, he came to. And he took his hands off me. Very traumatic. I know it had to have been traumatic for his kids seeing that. And to him, it was nothing. It's like, you deserved it. You got me mad, you deserved it. I'm still crying and screaming. I was saying, you son of a bitch, get out of my damn vehicle. I said, don't come around me or these twins again. Don't ever come around us.
You will never see me or
And I got the heck out of there. Knowing that he would attack me physically, then it was becoming real. It was becoming real. If the kids hadn't been in the car, I believe he would have taken it another step. I truly believe that. I don't think he would have held back.
Do you think he would have killed you?
I think he would have came close. After that, I didn't feel safe. I was honestly scared for myself, seeing him in such a rage like I'd never seen before. He was getting worse, and I didn't want to fear what would come next. I didn't think anything of the robbery. I heard about it, but I only listened because that was the bank Philip and I used. You know, I just kind of wonder why they picked that bank, but no, nothing really seemed abnormal. It was approximately a week later, Philip called me at work.
Hello?
And he said, I need to talk to you about something. He said, did you know anything about that bank robbery over there in Joplin? I said, I've seen it. You know, I've seen it on the news. I don't know anything about it. He goes, that was me that did it. I was like, what? That was when he said, I need you to meet me tomorrow at the park in Carl Junction. I will be there. I need to talk to you about something. Oh, I'm bewildered. I'm shocked. I didn't know what to say. I didn't want to call the cops just yet. But yes, I was planning on something. To be honest, I was scared to call the police. I cannot explain how scared I was because I knew if I called the police, I knew I would have hell to pay if he got out and came to my house. I wasn't willing to risk that. And he goes, they're after me. He said, someone from the FBI's been following me. And I said, really? He goes, yeah, I can't get away from them. Everywhere I go, they're there. And I knew, at that point, I knew, I got him. He lost touch with reality. It was really bad, his paranoia at that time. And he goes, "What do you think I should do?" I said, "Philip, you've got the FBI on you. We need to go turn you in to the police department." He sat there for a minute. I was shocked. He goes, "You're right. I need to go ahead and turn myself in." When I walked through the front door of the police station and I say, "I've got the person that you all are looking for that robbed the Joplin Metro Credit Union." She was like, she thought it was a joke. I said, "He's right here." You know, I don't think people routinely turn themselves in at the front desk. And she goes, I'll call a police officer right now." The police officer came up, verified who he was. He confirmed that he had robbed the bank, and they took him away in cuffs. I did speak to the patrolman for a moment, and he did tell me, he said, "Sherry, we didn't have any prospects. We had no idea who had robbed that bank." And he probably would have gotten away with it.
So he would have gotten away with it if you didn't convince him to turn himself in. Does that make this moment a little sweeter for you?
Absolutely. Absolutely. It was the best day of my life.
Yeah, I went over there to get messed up and have sex with her, and but I didn't go over there with the intentions of forcing her to have sex or anything else. I just remember I was trying to get her to stop fighting or whatever. I did it. I'm going to tell her mother that I'd done it. I mean, I don't know why I done it. And maybe it's because she was started to reject me.
When he confessed to killing Rebecca Sutton, it was real then that he was a murderer, and I had been living with him. This is Philip's mugshot from the Missouri Department of Corrections. The first look at this picture, it alarmed me. It frightened me. I didn't realize seeing him in a picture like this would bother me so much. I look at his eyes, and this is frightening to look at. I know my pulse is racing and my heart is beating fast. I didn't know I was still so frightened of him. The thing that he had adamantly denied all those years, did it. And then I really wanted to know how he did it.
I just remember I choked her. I went into a rage. But I felt the life drain out of me, my stomach. Because it made me mad. But I relived it in my mind and I can't figure it out. I can't tell you why.
Immediately went back to him choking me. And I thought to myself, I can't imagine this poor girl going through this and dying dying by his hands, and I had his hands around my throat. That just sent chills up and down my spine. Oh. This is Rebecca Sutton. This innocent-looking girl. This is who he murdered. Look at that. She didn't deserve that. Beautiful-looking girl. This young girl did not deserve to die by the hands of Philip. Who do I apologize to? Do I apologize? What do I say? Nothing can bring her back. And that family's pain that he caused. I think that's what bothers me more than anything. Her murder had occurred just a couple of years before Philip and I met and got together. That is frightening. That he could kill a couple of years before meeting me. You can see she's happy with her life. And to take that away from her and her family, she was gone so long and they didn't know where she was. They had no answers. I've never seen this picture. This is the forest where Philip hid her body. I understood he hid it underneath a rock ledge. I can't believe she was found there. I can't imagine a more disgraceful thing to do to someone's remains. No more respect for life than that. Under a rock ledge. Just let them decay there. While the family's crying out, where's our daughter?
The family of Rebecca Sutton lined the first two rows of the Taney County courtroom Thursday, ready and waiting for a killer's confession 10 years in the making. John admitted he strangled Sutton and dumped her body, covering it with rocks, pleading guilty to second-degree murder.
Had he pleaded the charge of second-degree murder?
I liked that. I liked seeing him being judged for the crime that he committed, and seeing him admit that he did that. It's very satisfying. I know it was very satisfying for her family. It is a weird feeling that he did fly under the radar for so long and was able to keep it so low key. He covered it very, very well. A master manipulator. I look back over those years and I think, what truth was there to it? Because he lied to me the entire time. There was no truth to that marriage. Along with the violence and the emotional abuse. This is Philip again in the Missouri prison. For some reason, he looks different. He looks frail. He looks very frail. Oh, he is definitely where he belongs. Definitely. He just looks so weak to me. When I think I'm not that strong, I need to remember this. I did this. I was able to get him put away to keep him from hurting anybody else. I did that. I had the power that day. And I feel seeing him like that, it gives me more power again. I'm glad to see this. He does not deserve to ever get out. I truly believe he would kill again. He's a killer. That won't change. You can die there. I never want to see you again. Strangely, with my family saying something was off with him, now I can say I wish I did listen to them. I was just trying to be strong then, trying to be independent, trying to handle my own problems. The advice I would give my young self is trust your heart, trust your feelings, listen to other people around you. Don't think it's just what you think is right, because sometimes you might be missing some of the picture. My life post-Philip has been very good to me. The twins, they're doing very well. Very well. Just finished high school. He's missed out on a lot. I feel like a survivor. I'm not that weak person anymore. She's long gone.
He thought she was your everyday nice old lady. She did hide all of it as much as she could. John had no idea what he was getting into. I knew she had this history of attempted murder, and John was a good guy.
There is a profound and deeply unsettling paradox when violence erupts in spaces expressly dedicated to the elevation of the human spirit. We are conditioned to associate the most brutal acts of crime with dark, isolated environments, with the desperation of the streets, or with the hidden, long-festering animosities that sometimes curdle behind the closed doors of seemingly ordinary domestic life. We do not expect the darkest expressions of human impulse to manifest within the sacred walls of a theater, a sanctuary designed for creation, reflection, and the celebration of cultural identity. Yet, the history of true crime continuously reminds us that human nature is an unpredictable landscape, capable of shattering our most deeply held assumptions about safety, reverence, and the bounds of interpersonal relationships. This is a narrative about the complete and devastating collapse of such a relationship. It is a story that unfolds not in a sprawling, anonymous metropolis, but in the close-knit, culturally rich environment of American Samoa, specifically within the quiet village of Tafuna. On a Saturday evening in late May of the year 2024, the Galamoana Theater, an artistic hub meant to foster imagination and preserve local heritage, became the staging ground for a tragedy so shocking, so fundamentally incomprehensible, that it sent shockwaves far beyond the shores of the Pacific. This was not a random act of violence perpetrated by a stranger in the night. It was an intimate, visceral destruction involving two of the most revered, intellectually brilliant, and culturally significant figures in the modern history of the region. The community was suddenly forced to grapple with what would quickly be recognized as a devastating double loss, a catastrophic event that simultaneously claimed the life of a revered elder stateswoman of letters and irrevocably condemned the legacy of the region's most celebrated contemporary literary talent. To understand the absolute magnitude of this tragedy, one must first understand the monumental stature of the woman whose life was so violently extinguished. Professor Caroline Sinaviana Gabbard was 77 years old, a woman who carried with her not just the wisdom of age, but the profound, pioneering legacy of a lifelong trailblazer. She was not merely a teacher or an academic. She was an institution unto herself, a towering intellect who spent her entire existence breaking down barriers and amplifying the voices of the Pacific. History will forever record her name as the very first person of Samoan descent to achieve the esteemed rank of a full professor at a prestigious United States academic institution. This milestone was not easily won. It was the culmination of decades of rigorous intellectual labor, an unwavering dedication to her craft, and an unyielding belief in the inherent value of her cultural heritage. For nearly 20 years, Professor Sinaviana Gabbard walked the halls of the University of Hawaii at Manoa, standing before countless students as a beacon of knowledge and representation. As a professor of English and Pacific literature, she did much more than analyze texts. She validated an entire worldview, ensuring that the complex, nuanced narratives of her ancestors and her contemporaries were studied with the exact same critical rigor and respect traditionally reserved for the Western literary canon. She taught her students to find their own voices by demonstrating, through her own elegant prose and poetry, that their stories mattered immensely. Beyond her academic achievements, her identity was deeply woven into a prominent family tapestry. She was the aunt of Tulsi Gabbard, a former United States Congresswoman and presidential candidate. While her family name resonated loudly in the aggressive, high-stakes arenas of Washington politics, Professor Caroline chose a different kind of influence. Hers was the quiet, enduring power of education, poetry, and cultural preservation. When the time came for her to retire from the demanding schedule of university life, she did not choose a quiet, anonymous existence on the mainland. Instead, she made the deliberate, purposeful decision to return to her homeland of American Samoa. She came back to the islands to continue her life's work, seeking to invest her vast reservoir of knowledge, her prestige, and her endless capacity for mentorship directly into the community that had nurtured her early years. She was the matriarch of the literary community, a woman who had spent a lifetime building bridges, only to find her final moments in an environment she had spent her life trying to elevate. Standing opposite her in this tragic tableau was a woman who represented the absolute zenith of the next generation's creative potential. Papaliai Sia Figiel, at 57 years of age, was not just a successful writer. She was a genuine literary phenomenon, a force of nature whose words had shattered the boundaries of Pacific literature and demanded the attention of the global artistic community. Figiel was a master of multiple disciplines, functioning simultaneously as a novelist, a poet, and a playwright with a fiercely original voice. Her explosive entry into the upper echelons of international literature was cemented in 1997 when she was awarded the highly prestigious Commonwealth Writers' Prize for her groundbreaking work, Where We Once Belonged. That single achievement did more than just establish her career. It placed Samoan literature firmly on the global map, proving that the intricate, deeply specific experiences of island life held a universal resonance that could captivate readers and critics across the world. Figiel was celebrated for her bold, uncompromising narratives, her ability to weave traditional storytelling forms with raw, contemporary realities. She was a visionary, and the Galamoana Theater in Tafuna was the physical manifestation of that vision. As the owner and operator of this cultural space, she held the keys to a kingdom of creativity, providing a platform for local artists and striving to cultivate the exact kind of vibrant, unapologetic cultural expression that her own work embodied. On the surface, Figueil possessed everything an artist could desire: critical acclaim, international recognition, and a dedicated physical space in her homeland to foster her art and the art of others. The most agonizing dimension of this entire narrative is the profound, intricate bond that existed between these two extraordinary women. This was not a professional rivalry. It was not a sudden clash between strangers. It was a deeply rooted, long-standing friendship built on a foundation of mutual respect, shared cultural passions, and an intimate understanding of the unique pressures faced by Indigenous women in the literary arts. For many years, Professor Caroline Sinaviana-Gabbard served as a crucial mentor to Sia Figueil. During the early, formative stages of Figueil's career, when the immense weight of artistic ambition meets the terrifying reality of the blank page, it was Caroline who provided guidance, support, and the steadying hand of experience. Caroline recognized the raw, brilliant talent burning within the younger woman and took it upon herself to nurture it, to elevate it, and to help navigate the complexities of the academic and publishing worlds. They were allies in a shared cultural crusade, two generations of Samoan brilliance working in tandem to ensure that their people's stories would not be forgotten or marginalized. Their relationship was emblematic of the beautiful, cyclical nature of mentorship, where the pioneer opens the door and the prodigy walks through to conquer new territories. For the community looking on, their connection was a source of immense pride, a symbol of continuity and strength within the artistic landscape of the Pacific. The Galamoana Theater, therefore, should have stood as a monument to their collective achievements and their shared dreams. It was a space that inherently belonged to both of them, legally owned by the protege, but spiritually sustained by the cultural foundation laid down by the mentor. When one imagines a Saturday evening in such a space, the mind conjures images of quiet reflection, the soft murmur of artistic discussion, the planning of future performances, or simply the comforting silence shared by two old friends who understand each other completely. The mind does not, and cannot, readily comprehend how decades of trust, admiration, and shared history can completely evaporate in a matter of moments, replaced by a sudden, devastating surge of lethal violence. The sheer impossibility of reconciling their celebrated public personas and their beautiful private friendship with the horrific reality of what transpired on that late May evening is what makes this case so deeply haunting. It challenges our fundamental understanding of human stability. It forces us to ask terrifying questions about the fragility of the human mind and the terrifying proximity between profound creative genius and devastating psychological darkness. When the unimaginable happens between two people who've spent their entire lives trying to articulate the deepest truths of the human condition, the resulting silence is deafening. The loss is not merely calculated in the tragic death of an elderly, beloved professor, nor is it only measured by the sudden, catastrophic downfall of a brilliant playwright. The true measure of this tragedy is the gaping, unfillable void left in the cultural heart of American Samoa, a community suddenly stripped of its brightest guiding light and its most powerful, resonant voice, both destroyed in a single, inexplicable crucible of violence within the very walls that were built to protect and celebrate their shared legacy. This is the dark, heavy atmosphere that descended upon the village of Tafuna, setting the stage for a nightmare that the community is still struggling to wake from, an incident where the pen was cast aside and the darkest, most primitive aspects of human fury took center stage, forever altering the history of the island and the landscape of Pacific literature. Saturday evening, May the 25th, 2024, began like any other tranquil weekend in the village of Tafuna. The tropical air was likely heavy with the familiar humidity of American Samoa, the kind of evening that invites a slowing down of pace and a retreat into the comfort of family and community. In the heart of this setting stood the Gala Theater, a structure that was meant to be a sanctuary for artistic expression and cultural preservation. It was a space meticulously cultivated by Papalii Sia Figil to house the echoes of ancestral stories and the vibrant pulse of contemporary Pacific artistry. The theater, with its walls designed to absorb the applause and the profound silence of captivated audiences, was fundamentally a place of creation. It is crucial to understand the sanctity of this environment to fully grasp the absolute desecration that was about to unfold within its confines. When a space is entirely dedicated to the elevation of the human spirit, the introduction of raw, unbridled violence into that specific geometry creates a terrifying dissonance. The Gala Theater was about to be transformed from a beacon of cultural pride into a tomb of unfathomable betrayal, a silent witness to a sudden and catastrophic rupture in the fabric of human decency. On this particular evening, Professor Caroline Sinaviana Gabbard made her way to the Cultural Center to visit her longtime friend and former protege. At 77 years old, the esteemed professor carried the dignified vulnerability of her age, her physical presence perhaps more fragile than in her youth, yet still commanding the immense respect that her lifetime of groundbreaking achievements demanded. She entered the domain of the younger woman, stepping into the space that her own years of mentorship had indirectly helped to build. This was a private encounter, stripped of the public accolades and the academic formalities that usually define their interactions with the outside world. It was simply two women, bound by decades of shared history, occupying a room filled with the quiet shadows of an unlit stage. The fundamental trust inherent in such a meeting cannot be overstated. When a mentor visits a student, especially in the twilight of their life, there is an absolute assumption of safety, reliance on the deep roots of gratitude and mutual affection that are supposed to anchor the relationship against any storm. Caroline walked into the Gala Theater with the calm assurance of a woman visiting a cherished extension of her own intellectual family. However, the atmosphere inside the theater rapidly deteriorated. What began as a meeting between two towering figures of Pacific literature soon devolved into a severe and intensely personal dispute. The precise details of the subject matter that ignited this conflict have remained sealed within the confines of the ongoing investigation, guarded as an undisclosed personal matter. Yet, the specific nature of the catalyst is perhaps less important than the terrifying velocity of the escalation. This was not a mere disagreement over artistic direction or a gentle clash of generational perspectives. It was a visceral, deeply rooted argument that tore through the superficial layers of professional courtesy and struck at the very core of their complex dynamic. Words, the very tools they had both mastered to build their illustrious careers, were weaponized in the dimly lit space of the theater. The air grew thick with a mounting hostility that seemed entirely incongruous with their celebrated history. The argument swelled, pushing both women toward a dangerous psychological precipice where reason begins to fracture and the darkest impulses of human emotion threaten to take control. For Papalii Sia Figil, this precipice was not entirely unfamiliar territory. Friends and colleagues within their intimate literary circle would later reveal that the brilliant playwright had been quietly struggling with severe, unaddressed psychological instability for an extended period. The intense pressure of her own genius, combined with the heavy, unspoken burdens of her mental state, had created a volatile internal landscape. The heated exchange with her revered mentor acted as the fatal spark that ignited this hidden reservoir of chaos. As the argument reached its absolute zenith, the psychological tether that anchored Figil to reality, to morality, and to the profound love she supposedly held for the older woman, violently snapped. The intellectual facade dissolved entirely, replaced by a terrifying, primal rage. In that singular, devastating moment, Sia Figil ceased to be the celebrated author and visionary theater director. She became entirely consumed by a blinding, uncontrollable fury that demanded immediate and catastrophic physical expression, entirely erasing the humanity of the woman standing before her. The transition from verbal conflict to physical violence was shockingly abrupt and incredibly brutal. In the throes of her uncontrolled anger, Figil sought out a weapon, her hands closing around the heavy, unforgiving wooden and metal mass of a hammer. The presence of such a tool in a theater is not unusual, often used for constructing sets and maintaining the facility, but its sudden repurposing into an instrument of death is a chilling testament to the frantic desperation of the assault. Without a shred of hesitation, Figil swung the hammer with devastating force, directing the heavy metal head entirely at the most vulnerable part of her mentor. The blows rained down upon Professor Caroline's head in a relentless, terrifying sequence. The sheer physical disparity between the 57-year-old aggressor, fueled by adrenaline and rage, and the 77-year-old victim rendered the older woman utterly defenseless. The horrific sound of the impacts, a sickening contrast to the poetry that usually filled the room, echoed off the walls of the Galamoana Theater. The blunt force trauma inflicted by the hammer was immediate and catastrophic. Professor Caroline, entirely overwhelmed by the sudden and savage nature of the attack, was sent reeling. The immense shock of the betrayal, compounding the agonizing physical pain, must have been unfathomable in those fleeting, terrifying seconds. Stripped of any capacity to defend herself or reason with her attacker, the elderly scholar was driven to the floor. She collapsed onto the ground of the theater, severely disoriented, incapacitated, and bleeding, a towering figure of intellect reduced in mere moments to a desperately vulnerable state. The space that was meant to celebrate her life's work had suddenly transformed into an inescapable trap, the floorboards of the stage now bearing witness to an act of absolute, irreversible destruction. But the nightmare was far from over. The initial assault with the hammer, horrific as it was, did not satiate the explosive rage that had consumed Sia Figil. The violence did not plateau, it escalated into an even more lethal and deliberate phase. Leaving the battered professor on the ground, Figil turned away, not to seek help or to recoil in horror at her own actions, but to arm herself further. She moved with a terrifying, predatory focus, retrieving a large kitchen knife from somewhere within the facility. The shift from a blunt instrument of sudden rage to an edged weapon designed for slicing and penetrating signifies a dark evolution in the attack. It moved the assault from a chaotic outburst of anger to a definitive, targeted attempt to extinguish a life. Returning to where the helpless, 77-year-old woman lay, Figil stood over her former mentor, gripping the large blade. With a cold, terrifying determination, Figil unleashed the final, fatal sequence of the attack. She plunged the large kitchen knife directly into the chest and vital organs of Professor Caroline. The blade was driven down multiple times, each agonizing thrust designed to cause maximum internal damage. This was an intimate, visceral form of murder, requiring the attacker to be in close physical proximity, to feel the resistance of the body, and to witness the immediate, devastating consequences of the wounds. The stabs were entirely unrelenting, a frantic and absolute dismantling of human life. The brilliant, pioneering mind that had elevated Pacific literature, the gentle voice that had guided countless students, and the heart that had nurtured the very woman holding the knife, were systematically and brutally silenced. Under the relentless barrage of fatal stab wounds, Professor Caroline Sinaviana finally succumbed to the massive trauma and blood loss, passing away on the cold floor of the theater she had helped inspire. As the final breath left the professor's body, a heavy, suffocating silence descended upon the Galamoana Theater. The explosive energy of the attack instantly evaporated, leaving behind a scene of unspeakable carnage. In the immediate aftermath of this savage murder, one might expect a sudden rush of panic, a desperate wail of remorse, or an urgent scramble to undo the irreversible. However, the subsequent actions of Papalii Sia Figil revealed a chilling and profound psychological detachment. Standing amidst the horrific reality of what she had just accomplished, looking down at the lifeless, bloodied body of her oldest friend and greatest champion, Figil did not break down. She did not reach for a telephone to dial emergency services. She did not scream for an ambulance in a desperate, futile bid to save the woman she had just destroyed. Instead, an eerie, methodical calmness seemingly washed over her. The renowned playwright, her hands and clothes undoubtedly stained with the evidence of her terrible crime, began to assess the environment with a grim, chilling pragmatism. Recognizing the sheer volume of blood and the chaotic state of the room, she initiated a superficial attempt to manage the aftermath. She engaged in a rudimentary cleanup of the immediate area, a frantic yet strangely calculated effort to impose some form of order onto a space that had just witnessed absolute chaos. She wiped down surfaces, perhaps attempting to corral the spreading pool of blood or to obscure the most glaring indicators of the struggle. This was not the meticulous, forensic cleaning of a seasoned criminal attempting to erase all traces of a murder, but rather the disoriented, desperate tidying of a fractured mind trying to compartmentalize an atrocity. It was an entirely futile gesture, a pathetic attempt to mask the monumental tragedy that dominated the center of the room. Despite these half-hearted efforts at concealment, the undeniable reality of the corpse remained. The body of Professor Caroline Sinaviana Gabbard lay abandoned on the floor, surrounded by the physical testament to the violence she had endured. After completing her rudimentary, chaotic cleanup, Figiel made the conscious decision to simply walk away. She did not cover the body with a blanket out of a final, twisted sense of respect. She did not linger to mourn the catastrophic destruction of her own life and the life of her mentor. She simply turned her back on the horrific tableau she had painstakingly created. The heavy doors of the Galamoana Theater closed behind her, locking the profound tragedy inside the darkened building. The sanctuary of art had been permanently sealed as a tomb, holding the tragic remains of one of the Pacific's greatest minds in absolute, lonely silence. Stepping out into the humid darkness of the Defuna night, Papaliacia Figiel began her flight from the scene of the crime. She did not wander aimlessly, nor did she march directly to the local police precinct to confess her sins in the immediate wake of the adrenaline drop. Instead, she navigated through the familiar roads of her homeland, carrying the immense, crushing weight of a secret that would soon destroy her world. She made her way to the residence of a family member, seeking refuge within the protective, unquestioning walls of a relative's home. She crossed the threshold of that house not as a celebrated author, but as a fugitive from her own devastating actions. As she sat in the quiet of that home throughout the remainder of the night, the profound, unalterable finality of what she had done in the shadows of the theater must have begun to settle upon her, setting the stage for a prolonged, agonizing silence that would stretch across the entirety of the following day, while the island of American Samoa slept, entirely unaware that it had just lost one of its most irreplaceable souls in a nightmare of unimaginable cruelty. The silence that blanketed the village of Tafuna throughout the following day, Sunday, May 26th, was a heavy, suffocating shroud that belied the horror locked within the walls of the Galamoana Theater. While the world outside moved with the rhythm of a standard island Sunday, the ringing of church bells, the quiet preparation of family meals, and the slow, deliberate pace of life in American Samoa, the theater itself remained a silent, gruesome vault. Inside, the body of Professor Caroline Sinaviana Gabbard lay abandoned in the darkness, the victim of a betrayal so profound it defied any rational explanation. For Cia Figiel, that Sunday was a day of profound, agonizing psychological suspension. She had retreated to the home of a relative, a sanctuary that now acted as a cocoon for her shattering reality. The adrenaline that had propelled the brutal violence of the night before had long since faded, replaced by a cold, encroaching realization of the monumental weight of her actions. One can only imagine the fractured state of her mind during those long, agonizing hours of forced silence. She had successfully hidden in the physical evidence for the time being, but the internal burden of the murder must have been an unbearable, constant pressure, a relentless reminder of the irreversible act that had destroyed both the life of her mentor and her own future. As the sun tracked across the sky, Figiel existed in a state of purgatory. The relative she sought refuge with likely had no inkling of the catastrophic violence that had occurred at the theater only hours prior. The dissonance between the image of the celebrated, respected playwright and the reality of the cold-blooded murderer she had become was likely bridged by a wall of terrifying silence. Every interaction, Every fleeting conversation and every moment of normality must have been fraught with the excruciating fear of exposure. The quietude of that Sunday was not a reprieve. It was a slow, tightening noose. The psychological pressure of keeping the murder a secret, of maintaining a semblance of composure while the specter of the crime haunted her every thought, began to take its toll. The questions that likely came from her family, inquiring about her well-being, her plans, or why she seemed distant and distressed, would have been sharp, invasive probes into a psyche that was already crumbling under the weight of an irreparable transgression. The pressure, the guilt, and the sheer, overwhelming reality of what she had unleashed could only be contained for so long before the internal psychological dam finally breached. By the early morning of Monday, May 27th, the psychological collapse was absolute. The internal wall Figil had erected to hold back the horror of her actions had disintegrated. The persistent, gnawing awareness of what lay in the dark theater, and the profound, crushing burden of her culpability became a suffocating reality she could no longer endure. The act of concealment had become as traumatic as the act of violence itself. It was during these final, agonizing moments of resistance that Figil finally reached her breaking point. She recognized, with a clarity that only comes in the deepest throes of despair, that she could not continue to live in the shadow of this secret. The decision to step into the light, to abandon the illusion of her innocence, was perhaps the only way to alleviate the unbearable, crushing pressure on her soul. She chose to end the period of silence, signaling the beginning of the inevitable, legal aftermath that would finally bring the truth of the tragedy into the open. On the morning of May 27th, Sia Figil emerged from her relative's home, accompanied by a family member who was likely reeling from the sudden, catastrophic revelation of what had actually occurred. Together, they made the solemn, final journey to the Tafuna police station. The act of walking through the doors of the station, of approaching the officers on duty, and of initiating the process of confession must have been a moment of profound, surreal weight. For the officers at the desk, who would have known Figil as a prominent local figure and artist, her arrival and the subsequent admission were initially beyond comprehension. It was not a scenario they were prepared for. The idea that a woman of her standing, a celebrated writer and pillar of the community, had just walked in to confess to the brutal, savage murder of a pioneering academic was entirely alien to the local experience. The confession itself, delivered in the sterile, fluorescent-lit environment of the police station, was direct and unambiguous. Figil recounted the reality of the events of that Saturday evening, detailing the visit from Professor Caroline, the escalation of the argument, and the horrifying sequence of violence that had followed. She admitted to using the hammer as a weapon of blunt force trauma and then, with calculated, lethal intent, utilizing a kitchen knife to end the professor's life. She provided the location of the body, directing the authorities to the Galamoana Theater, the space that had served as the theater of her crime. The confession, while simple in its delivery, was a devastating admission that tore through the fabric of the community's collective disbelief. It wasn't just a statement of fact. It was an admission of a catastrophic moral failure, a betrayal of the most profound kind, and a final, permanent shattering of the legacy she had spent her life constructing. The officers, processing this information, moved quickly to formalize the admission, initiating the chain of command that would lead to the immediate investigation of the scene she had described. The reaction within the Tafuna Police Department and the broader community of American Samoa was one of profound, paralyzed shock. The news rippled through the island with alarming speed, transforming a quiet, productive Monday morning into a day of mourning and incomprehension. Law enforcement personnel were dispatched immediately to the Galamoana Theater, the site of the crime. Entering the theater must have been a haunting, visceral experience. The space, designed for light, sound, and the suspension of disbelief, was now defined by the heavy, oppressive presence of death. The officers stepped into the room, their flashlights cutting through the darkness, eventually finding the remains of Professor Caroline Sinaviana Gabbard exactly where Figil had described. The scene was one of clinical, horrific evidence. The discarded weapons, the bua and the knife, still stained with the proof of the violence that had taken place. The investigative team, tasked with securing the scene and documenting the evidence, worked with a somber, urgent focus. They meticulously cataloged the items, including the hammer and the large kitchen knife, both of which would soon become the focal points of the state's case against the playwright. These were no longer just tools of artistic labor or common household objects. They were the physical components of an absolute, irreversible tragedy. The blood evidence, the position of the body, and the overall state of the theater were all carefully recorded, providing the objective, forensic narrative that would eventually be used to hold Sia Figiel accountable. As the investigators worked, the reality of the crime began to solidify, moving from the surreal, incomprehensible confession of an individual to a documented, undeniable, and horrific event in the history of the island. The discovery of the body marked the end of the initial, frantic period of uncertainty and the beginning of the long, painful path toward judicial resolution. For the investigators, the task was no longer to find a killer, but to piece together the narrative of the event, to verify the confession, and to prepare the evidence for the formal legal proceedings that were inevitable. Every piece of data collected at the scene, every mark on the floor, and every forensic detail was a testament to the life that had been stolen. The theater, previously a place of vibrant cultural expression, was now a sealed scene of a major crime, its doors locked tight against the outside world while the process of evidence gathering unfolded. The silence that had once been the quiet expectation of the theater was now the heavy, mourning silence of a crime scene. As the authorities continued their investigation, the broader community began to grapple with the sheer, crushing reality of the loss. The name Caroline Sinaviana-Gabbard, which had always been associated with intellectual achievement and cultural pride, was now permanently, tragically linked to the story of a brutal murder. The news traveled beyond the shores of American Samoa, reaching the ears of the national academic and political communities, leaving them to process the loss of a pioneer. Meanwhile, Sia Figiel, the once celebrated author, was now firmly in the custody of the state, her future irrevocably altered by the horrific actions of that Saturday night. The path from the confession at the police station to the eventual courtroom would be long, but the initial steps, the admission of guilt and the discovery of the crime scene, had effectively sealed the fate of both the victim and the perpetrator. The tragedy was no longer a secret, no longer a dark, hidden whisper in the night. It was a matter of official record, a devastating chapter in the story of a woman who had given so much to her people, only to have her life extinguished in the very place she had sought to build, at the hands of the very person she had sought to lift up. The investigation, while focused on the cold, hard facts of the crime, was also a desperate attempt to bring some semblance of order and understanding to a situation that was, by its very nature, entirely, utterly beyond comprehension. The investigation that followed the grim discovery at the Galamoana Theater was not merely a procedural exercise in gathering evidence. It was an exhaustive, somber effort to map the final hours of a life and the descent of a mind into a void of irreversible violence. Once the crime scene was officially processed and the body of Professor Caroline Sinaviana-Gabbard transported for forensic examination, the focus of the authorities shifted toward the technical reconstruction of the tragedy. Law enforcement officials, working under the immense scrutiny that accompanies such high-profile cases, meticulously analyzed every inch of the theater. The goal was to align the physical realities of the room with the confession provided by Papalii Sia Figiel. This required a level of forensic precision that contrasts sharply with the chaotic, emotional nature of the crime itself. They cataloged the trajectory of the struggle, the placement of the weapons, and the forensic patterns of the blood, each element serving as a silent, objective witness to the brutality that had occurred on that Saturday evening. For the detectives assigned to the case, the confession served as the skeleton of the narrative, but the flesh of the investigation relied on the silent testimony left behind in the theater. They studied the hammer, looking for the telltale indentations and trace evidence that would definitively tie it to the fatal, blunt force trauma sustained by the professor. They analyzed the kitchen knife, examining the blade's configuration against the wounds identified in the coroner's report, seeking to confirm the systematic, deliberate nature of the stabbing. This scientific verification was not just about establishing guilt. It was about honoring the memory of the victim by ensuring the truth of her final moments was documented with absolute, uncompromising accuracy. Every photograph taken at the scene, every sample collected, and every measurement recorded served to paint a complete, undeniable picture of the event, leaving no room for the potential shifts in memory or the potential for defense-led reinterpretations of the tragedy. Simultaneously, the investigative team began the arduous task of probing into the background of the perpetrator, seeking to understand the psychological mechanisms that had led to such a profound rupture in reality. While Figiel had been a public figure, celebrated for her literary prowess and her creative leadership, the investigation necessitated a deep, clinical excavation into the private shadows of her existence. They interviewed friends, colleagues, and associates within the literary and artistic circles of American Samoa, seeking to identify the signs of the psychological instability that had reportedly plagued the playwright for an extended period. These interviews were delicate, characterized by a mix of genuine grief for the victim and a palpable, haunted confusion regarding the perpetrator. The witnesses spoke of a woman who was brilliant, visionary, and fiercely protective of her art, but who also carried a subtle, growing detachment, a volatility that had been masked by the success and status she enjoyed within the community. The information gathered during these interviews painted a haunting portrait of a genius struggling under a weight that she could no longer bear. The investigators learned of the mounting pressures of artistic expectations, the isolation that often accompanies the pursuit of a highly creative life, and the internal battles that were never fully articulated to the public. The relationship between Figiel and the late Professor Sinaviana Gabbard was dissected in this context, not as a simple mentor-mentee dynamic, but as a complex, emotionally charged bond that had apparently become a crucible for Figiel's mental decline. The investigators sought to understand if the specific nature of their final argument had been a long-simmering resentment or a sudden, explosive realization of some hidden conflict. While the official stance remained that the exact catalyst was a personal, undisclosed matter, the interviews provided a broader, more terrifying context for the crime. It was the logical, tragic conclusion to a long period of internal deterioration. Throughout this process, the weight of the investigation fell heavily upon the legal apparatus of American Samoa. The prosecutors, tasked with building a case that would withstand the gravity of the charges, had to balance the clear, confessed evidence of the crime with the sensitivity of the victim's family and the public's desperate need for justice. The charges brought against Sia Figiel, first-degree murder, were the only possible conclusion to an act so clearly premeditated and brutal. The evidence did not point to a sudden, impulsive accident. It pointed to a series of choices, each more lethal than the last, beginning with the acquisition of the hammer and culminating in the deliberate, systematic use of the knife. The investigators had to ensure that the chain of custody for all evidence was flawless, that every forensic detail was beyond reproach, and that the timeline of the murder was as airtight as the physical evidence suggested. One of the most significant aspects of the investigation was the interaction with the legal counsel involved on both sides. The defense, facing a client who had walked into a police station and confessed to the murder, had a profoundly difficult, restricted mandate. They were not tasked with proving her innocence, an impossibility in light of her admission, but rather with navigating the nuances of the judicial process, ensuring that the trial would account for the state of Figiel's mental health and the context of the event. The prosecutors, conversely, focused on the permanence of the crime. They emphasized the victim's standing in the community, the horrific nature of her death, and the deliberate choices made by the perpetrator that precluded any argument of spontaneity or accidental death. The interplay between these two legal teams, unfolding in the quiet, tense atmosphere of the pretrial period, was a struggle for the narrative of the case, a fight over the definition of responsibility and the appropriate response to such a catastrophic loss. The investigative process also forced the broader community to look inward. The case became a mirror, reflecting the vulnerabilities within the cultural and social structures of American Samoa. The fact that such a tragedy could happen in a place that prides itself on family, faith, and traditional values was a sobering, painful reality. The investigation was not just about the theater, it was about the island itself, about how it could nurture such brilliance only to see it end in such darkness. People began to talk, not just about the crime, but about the need for better mental health awareness, the importance of acknowledging the pressures faced by those in the public eye, and the necessity of support systems that could intervene before the seeds of such a tragedy could take root. The detectives, in their quest for the facts of the murder, unwittingly found themselves at the center of a much larger, more profound societal conversation, their work becoming the catalyst for a community to confront the uncomfortable, hidden truths of its own internal landscape. As the weeks turned into months, the investigation drew to a close, leaving the community with a sense of grim closure but little true resolution. The evidence had been gathered, the scene of the crime had been processed, and the case against Sia Figuil had been formalized by the Department of Justice. The investigators had done their duty, providing the objective, forensic narrative that would form the foundation of the legal battle to come. They had traveled the path from the initial confession to the final assembly of the trial evidence, ensuring that the voice of the victim, now permanently silenced, would be represented by the incontrovertible facts of her demise. Yet, for all their hard work, for all the meticulous cataloging of hammers and knives, for all the interviews and forensic reports, there remained a haunting, unreachable core to the tragedy. The mystery of the why, the exact, final provocation in that quiet theater, remained an enigma, a secret that had been sealed by the very act of murder. The investigators had successfully solved the how, but the why was forever locked in the history of that evening, a tragic, unanswered question that would continue to echo long after the trial had concluded. They had delivered the components of justice, but the true measure of the tragedy remained beyond their reach, a testament to the fact that when such a foundational bond is shattered, there is no amount of evidence that can truly explain the depth of the void that remains. The theater had been opened, its darkness catalogued, and its secrets harvested by the light of the law, yet the space remained forever changed, a testament to the fragility of life and the terrifying unpredictability of the human heart in the quiet, isolated corners of the Pacific. The judicial proceedings following the murder of Professor Caroline Sinaviana Gabbard unfolded with a somber, heavy atmosphere that seemed to permeate every corner of the courtroom in American Samoa. This was not a trial driven by the common theatrics of high-profile legal battles. Rather, it was a profound, almost ritualistic acknowledgement of a catastrophe that had fundamentally shaken the bedrock of the island's intellectual and cultural life. The legal system, designed to weigh facts and deliver accountability, was tasked with the nearly impossible objective of providing justice for a crime where the perpetrator had admitted to the act from the very beginning. The trial of Papalii Sia Figuil, therefore, became a complex exploration of responsibility, mental culpability, and the crushing weight of a legacy destroyed by an individual's sudden, catastrophic descent. As the proceedings began, the courtroom was packed with a community in mourning, a sea of faces that represented the very culture, literature, and academia that the professor had devoted her life to championing. For the family of the late professor, the trial was an agonizing endurance test, a formal recounting of the final, brutal moments of their loved one's life. Every piece of evidence presented, the photographs of the Galamoana Theater, the forensic analysis of the weapons, and the harrowing reports from the medical examiner, served as a fresh, devastating reminder of the loss they had endured. The prosecution, representing the Department of Justice, pursued the case with a calculated, steady resolve. They were not interested in sensationalism. They were focused on the absolute, undeniable facts. Their narrative was simple but chilling. This was not a tragic accident born of a fleeting moment of confusion. It was a sequence of intentional, calculated actions, a series of choices made by a woman who knew exactly what she was doing. They laid out the timeline with meticulous care, tracing the path from the initial, intense argument to the retrieval of the hammer and the final, fatal use of the kitchen knife, leaving no doubt in the minds of those present that the murder was a premeditated expression of a lethal rage. The defense, tasked with the representation of a woman whose own confession had effectively left them with a limited mandate, faced the daunting challenge of addressing the deep psychological context of the crime. They did not contest the fact that Sia Figuil had killed her mentor. To do so would have been an exercise in futility. Instead, their strategy revolved around the internal reality of the playwright's mind. They presented evidence and expert testimony regarding the severe, unaddressed psychological instability that had reportedly been consuming Figil for a long time. The defense argued that her actions on that Saturday night were not the product of a sound, rational mind, but the climax of a deep-seated mental deterioration that had finally pushed her beyond the limits of human control. They painted a picture of a brilliant, artistic spirit that had been slowly fractured by the pressures of the creative life, eventually becoming a victim of her own internal turmoil. This was a narrative that sought not to excuse the crime, but to provide a framework for understanding how such a celebrated, respected figure could commit such an act of unspeakable, savage cruelty. The witness testimonies were perhaps the most harrowing aspect of the trial. Friends, colleagues, and collaborators from the Pacific Literary Circle took the stand, their voices trembling with the weight of the conflicting emotions they harbored. They spoke of the professor as a mentor, a force of nature who had opened the world to them, and then, with equal pain, they spoke of Figil, not as a monster, but as a person they had known, admired, and worked with. The dissonance was palpable. How could the same hands that had written works that stirred the hearts of a generation be the same hands that had wielded a hammer and a knife against their most cherished guide? This was the central, uncomfortable question that the trial could never truly answer, yet it remained the focal point of every interaction within the courtroom. The testimony provided a window into the intimate, creative, and often high-pressured world of the two women, revealing the thin line that exists between the intensity of artistic passion and the darkness of mental fragmentation. When Papaliai Sia Figil herself took the stand, the courtroom fell into an absolute, suffocating silence. Her appearance was a stark, jarring transformation from the public figure she had once been. The confidence of the celebrated playwright was replaced by the hollow, haunted demeanor of a woman who was acutely aware of the permanence of her actions and the weight of the lives she had destroyed, the professor's and her own. In her testimony, she did not offer a defense, nor did she attempt to mitigate the horrific reality of the crime. She spoke with a quiet, devastating clarity about the events of that evening, detailing the atmosphere within the theater, the sudden, uncontrollable surge of her own rage, and the profound, crushing realization that had followed the murder. There was no attempt to deflect blame onto the victim. Instead, there was a stark, unsettling admission of the internal chaos that had overtaken her. Her words, stripped of any artistic embellishment, were the final piece of the forensic puzzle, a harrowing confirmation of the narrative the prosecution had carefully constructed. The judicial result was inevitable, given the nature of the charges and the weight of the evidence. The court, having weighed the arguments of the prosecution against the mental health testimony offered by the defense, found the defendant guilty of first-degree murder. The verdict was not met with cheers or outbursts, but with a collective, heavy sigh of resignation. The legal system had fulfilled its function. It had arrived at the only possible conclusion in the face of such a deliberate, savage act. The sentencing phase that followed was equally solemn. The judge, in delivering the mandatory life imprisonment sentence, spoke not only to the perpetrator but to the community at large, acknowledging the profound, lasting damage caused by the crime. The sentence, life without the possibility of parole, was a final, irreversible marker of the severity of the act, a decision that would ensure the perpetrator would spend the rest of her life in the confinement of the state's justice system, forever removed from the vibrant, creative life she had once enjoyed. The aftermath of the trial was a period of grim, necessary closure, but it did little to address the underlying, gnawing question of how the tragedy had occurred in the first place. The verdict had provided the legal finality that the community required, yet the emotional and psychological void left by the professor's death remained largely unfilled. The court had addressed the how and the who with absolute, legal precision, but the why was still largely shrouded in the enigma of Figil's internal state. The trial served to formalize the tragedy, to place the horror within the structure of law and order, and to finally provide the family of the professor with the official acknowledgement of the crime. Yet, As the gavel fell and the courtroom slowly emptied, it was clear that the legal process, while essential, was but a small part of the long, difficult road that the community would need to travel to process such a fundamental loss. The verdict was not a resolution. It was merely the conclusion of the first, darkest chapter in the history of the island, a moment of legal closure that left the deeper, more complex questions of mental health, mentorship, and the boundaries of human morality hanging in the cold, still air. The finality of the sentence was a heavy, permanent end to the public life of Papalii Figiel, an author who had once shaped the narrative of her people, only to have her own story come to a sudden, catastrophic halt within the walls of a courtroom, a victim of her own unforgivable, irreversible actions. The judicial process, for all its formality and rigor, had laid bare the raw, brutal heart of the tragedy, leaving the community with a daunting, quiet work of healing in the wake of an event that had, in a single night of violence, redefined their understanding of safety, respect, and the terrifying capacity for darkness in the human spirit. The repercussions of the murder of Professor Caroline Sinaviana-Gabbard and the subsequent fall of Papalii Figiel ripple across the cultural and social fabric of American Samoa with a weight that time has yet to diminish. This is a tragedy that defies easy categorization, leaving in its wake a profound, multifaceted grief that touches every aspect of the island's community. The loss of the professor is not merely the cessation of a brilliant life. It is the sudden, jarring extinction of a visionary who stood as a bridge between the deep, storied past of the Pacific and its complex, evolving future. Her absence is felt in the halls of academia, in the hearts of the students she mentored, and in the quiet, reflective spaces of the island where her voice was once a guiding, authoritative presence. The void she leaves behind is unfillable, a testament to the sheer, irreplaceable magnitude of her contributions to the literature and cultural identity of her people. It is a double loss in the truest sense, for the community has lost not only the elder who built the foundation but also the voice of the protege who is meant to carry that legacy forward into new, uncharted territories. The destruction of Sia Figiel's reputation and the irreparable contamination of her artistic legacy present a different, equally difficult challenge for the community. For years, she was a figure of pride, an artist whose work demanded international attention and who demonstrated that the experiences of islanders possessed a universal, gripping resonance. To reconcile that image of creative brilliance with the reality of her transformation into a murderer is a cognitive dissonance that the people of American Samoa are still actively navigating. There is a lingering, profound sadness that a woman of such extraordinary talent allowed herself to be consumed by the very darkness she often explored in her own narratives. Her case has become a cautionary tale, a grim, somber reflection on the dangers of unaddressed mental instability and the fragility of the human mind, even among those gifted with the greatest creative capacities. The literature she produced remains, but it is now forever shadowed by the horrific final act of her own life, forcing readers to engage with her work through the distorted lens of the tragedy she wrought. As the months following the trial have turned into a somber, reflective period of adjustment, the focus of the community has increasingly shifted toward the necessity of healing and the imperative of systemic change. The Galamoana Theater, once a vibrant hub of artistic life, remains a silent, haunted space, a physical monument to the event that shattered the collective sense of safety. Whether the theater will ever be reclaimed, repurposed, or permanently closed remains a question of intense, often quiet debate. It stands as a powerful, uncomfortable symbol of the thin, invisible line between the sanctuary of creation and the abyss of violence. The tragedy has forced a difficult, overdue conversation about the state of mental health services in American Samoa, with advocates and citizens alike calling for more robust, accessible support systems. There is a collective acknowledgement that the pressures faced by high-achieving individuals in the public eye are often obscured, and that a culture which prioritizes strength and community harmony must also create space for the honest, vulnerable acknowledgement of internal suffering. The family of Professor Caroline Sinaviana-Gabbard, who have navigated this nightmare with a dignity and grace that is nothing short of extraordinary, continue to be the steady, grounding center of the community's collective mourning. Their pain, while private, has been the compass by which the island has measured its own grief. Their advocacy for memory, for justice, and for the preservation of the professor's pioneering legacy has served as a vital, stabilizing force, ensuring that the narrative of her life is not permanently eclipsed by the brutality of her death. Through their strength, the focus remains firmly on the light she brought into the world, on the countless lives she touched through her teaching, and on the enduring, transformative power of the stories she shared. They have become the keepers of the flame, refusing to allow the tragedy to define the entirety of her existence, and instead, working tirelessly to ensure that her name remains synonymous with wisdom, courage, and the unwavering pursuit of truth. In the broader context of the literary arts, the case has sparked a deep, painful reflection on the responsibilities of the artist and the nature of the creative process. It has challenged writers, academics, and performers across the Pacific to confront the reality that talent, no matter how profound, does not insulate an individual from the basic, universal vulnerabilities of the human condition. The community is left to grapple with the realization that the very intensity required to create art can sometimes be the same intensity that blinds an individual to the moral boundaries of their own reality. This has led to a reevaluation of how the artistic community supports its members, emphasizing that the health and well-being of the creator must always be prioritized above the creation itself. It is a slow, difficult, and essential shift in perspective, one that seeks to prevent future tragedies by fostering a culture of mutual care, vigilance, and compassion that extends beyond the superficial successes of the professional sphere. Looking back on this horrific sequence of events, there is a lingering, haunting sense that the tragedy was a manifestation of unseen, accumulating pressures that finally reached an explosive, irreversible breaking point. The narrative is one that defies simple villains or clear-cut moral lessons. Instead, it is a complex, deeply woven tragedy of two lives that were inextricably linked by their shared devotion to their culture, only to be dismantled by the terrifyingly unpredictable volatility of the human spirit. The story of Caroline and Sia is now etched into the bedrock of the island's history, a somber, permanent mark that serves as a quiet, constant reminder of the fragility of even the most established and respected human bonds. It is a story that requires constant, gentle handling, a narrative that must be told with the utmost respect for the victim and the necessary, sobering honesty about the nature of the crime, always avoiding the trap of luring the observer into the darkness of the act itself. Ultimately, the community of American Samoa is engaged in the profound, laborious work of moving forward, though forward in this context is a relative term. The shadow of the tragedy has become a part of the landscape, a new, indelible layer in the story of the people. It is a story marked by a profound loss of innocence, a painful acknowledgement of the darkness that can dwell within, and a resilient, ongoing commitment to honoring the beauty that can still be found in the wake of such devastation. The lessons learned, while purchased at the most horrific of prices, are now guiding the way for a community that is more acutely aware of the preciousness of human life and the critical, life-saving necessity of empathy. In the quiet halls of the libraries, in the classrooms where the professor's influence is still felt, and in the small, intimate gatherings where stories are still shared, the legacy of Caroline Sinaviana Gabbard continues to evolve. She remains an enduring, guiding force, her life's work providing the intellectual and emotional scaffolding for people who are slowly, painfully, and courageously piecing together a new, more aware and more profoundly connected version of their own history. The tragedy, while permanent, does not have the final word. That belongs to the enduring impact of a life well lived and the persistent, hopeful capacity for a community to find solace in the shared, unwavering commitment to building a future that is, in some small, meaningful way, safer and more compassionate than the past that was so violently stolen. As the silence eventually gives way to the resumption of daily life, the name of the professor continues to be spoken with reverence, not as a symbol of her tragic end, but as a testament to the immense, far-reaching power of her spirit, which persists unyielding in the hearts and minds of those who continue to tell her story. The finality of the courtroom verdict provided a legal conclusion, but for the community of American Samoa, the process of reckoning with the death of Professor Caroline Sinaviana Gabbard was only just beginning. True justice, in the aftermath of such an intimate and soul-shattering event, is rarely confined to the walls of a prison or the technical pronouncements of a judge. It is, instead, a prolonged and difficult period of communal digestion, a collective effort to integrate the horror of the crime into the broader narrative of the island's history without allowing that horror to become the sole defining feature of their identity. The tragedy of May 2024 has become a permanent landmark in the collective consciousness, a point of reference that colors the way the people perceive the safety of their homes, the strength of their familial bonds, and the inherent stability of their public institutions. As the initial shock subsided, the islanders found themselves in a state of quiet, contemplative mourning, searching for ways to honor the professor's monumental contributions while simultaneously processing the devastating, transformative reality of her final moments. In the academic world, the loss of Professor Sinaviana Gabbard was akin to the removal of a primary pillar supporting the structure of Pacific studies. Her absence left a void in the literature departments and the cultural organizations that she had spent her life cultivating. Colleagues who once relied on her sharp, incisive critiques and her deep, intuitive understanding of Samoan literature now found themselves having to synthesize her influence without her physical presence. The academic community began a concerted effort to codify her work, to ensure that the decades of lectures, essays, and poetry she produced were preserved for future generations who would never have the privilege of hearing her speak or experiencing her mentorship firsthand. This was an act of intellectual reclamation, an attempt to solidify her legacy against the eroding forces of time and the lingering shadow cast by the manner of her death. Every seminar held in her memory and every scholarship established in her name was a brick in the wall of her enduring legacy, a way of ensuring that her voice, which had been so brutally silenced in the Galamoana Theater, would continue to resonate in the classrooms and hearts of her people for decades to come. For those who were part of the inner circle of the artistic and literary communities in American Samoa, the tragedy demanded a difficult internal restructuring. They were forced to look at the relationships they held with one another with a new, more wary lens. The ease with which the trust between two such respected figures could be incinerated created a climate of vulnerability that had not existed before. The artistic community, historically a space of deep collaboration and mutual support, had to navigate the tension between the desire to preserve the spirit of creativity and the necessity of acknowledging the psychological burdens that often accompany it. This period of reflection led to the implementation of more robust support structures within the arts, a realization that the professional environment must also be a safe harbor for the mental health of its practitioners. The death of the professor and the downfall of Sia Figil served as a stark, irrevocable reminder that the health of the community is fundamentally linked to the health of its most sensitive and creative members, and that neglect in this arena can lead to consequences of devastating proportions. The family of the professor remained the most poignant figures in this long aftermath. Their ability to remain public symbols of grace in the face of such unspeakable violence was a testament to the character that had shaped the professor herself. They navigated the public nature of the tragedy with a quiet, unwavering resolve, ensuring that the focus of any discussion regarding the professor was always on her life, her wisdom, and the enduring impact of her literary voice. In the quiet moments away from the cameras and the public scrutiny, one can only imagine the depth of the grief they carried, a private, heavy reality that existed outside the scope of the legal proceedings or the community's collective processing. They were the ones who truly knew the woman behind the academic titles and the celebrated name, the one who navigated the challenges of a complex, brilliant life with a resilience that had become part of their own family tapestry. Their ongoing commitment to her memory became a form of resistance against the finality of the crime, a way of asserting that her influence could not be contained or destroyed by the actions of a single, broken individual. As the months stretched into years, the physical site of the tragedy, the Galamoana Theater, continued to exert a strange, gravitational pull on the community's sense of closure. Whether it remained as a vacant, haunting reminder of the crime, or was eventually transformed into something new, it occupied a space in the imagination of the villagers that was difficult to clear. It was a site of trauma, but it was also a site of great artistic endeavor, and the tension between these two realities made it a symbol of the larger conflict the community was facing: how to remember the brilliance of their history while acknowledging the darkness of their reality. The theater became a physical manifestation of the need to reconcile with the past, to walk through the doors of history with eyes wide open, even when the contents of the room are difficult to confront. The islanders began to see that the process of healing was not about erasing the memory of the crime, but about weaving it into the fabric of their understanding, acknowledging the pain so that it might eventually be integrated into a more comprehensive, resilient identity. The wider Pacific literature movement, often looking toward American Samoa as a leader in cultural expression, also underwent a period of self-examination. The tragedy forced a broader dialogue about the nature of mentorship and the dynamics of power and influence in the literary world. It prompted discussions about the isolation that can be felt by those who are the first to break barriers, and the necessity of sustaining a community that provides emotional and psychological support for its pioneers. The death of Professor Sinaviana Gabbard and the incarceration of Figil were seen as a systemic failure to protect and nurture those who, in their own ways, were working to redefine the narrative of the Pacific. This dialogue was not meant to assign blame where it did not belong, but to foster a more empathetic and proactive environment where the pressures of achievement do not come at the expense of human well-being. It was a sign of growth, a movement toward a more mature, interconnected, and supportive community that recognized the inherent worth of its people beyond their professional accomplishments or their role as cultural figureheads. In the end, the story of this period in American Samoa is one of profound, transformative resilience. The island is not the same as it was before that fateful May evening. It has been marked, irrevocably changed by the violence that shook its core. Yet, in that change, there is the potential for a deeper, more intentional way of life. The tragedy served as an abrasive, uncomfortable catalyst for growth, forcing the community to confront its own vulnerabilities and to prioritize the well-being of its members in a way that had perhaps been neglected before. The legacy of Professor Caroline Sinaviana Gabbard is now not just found in her books or her teaching, but in the heightened empathy and the collective wisdom of the people who continue to cherish her memory. She has become an ancestor in the truest sense, a guiding presence whose life and death have provided the island with a new understanding of the value of compassion and the critical, life-saving importance of maintaining the integrity of human connections. The story of her life and the reality of her passing will continue to be told, not as a tragedy to be avoided, but as a lesson to be integrated, a somber, essential chapter in the evolving, vibrant, and enduring history of the Pacific, a testament to the fact that even in the face of the most unthinkable betrayal, a community can find the strength to hold onto the light that defines them. As we reach the final reflection on this harrowing chronicle, we are forced to confront the enduring silence that now defines the legacy of those once vibrant lives. The passage of time does not provide the remedy of forgetfulness. Instead, it serves as a slow, deliberate lens through which the full, crushing weight of the tragedy comes into sharper focus. In the quiet village of Tafuna, the echoes of the Galamoana Theater have faded into a stillness that feels heavy with the gravity of what was lost. The narrative of Professor Caroline Sinaviana Gabbard and Papaliaicea Figil is no longer just a headline or a case file. It has become an inseparable part of the island's ancestral memory, a story that parents will one day share with their children not as a cautionary tale of violence, but as a meditation on the fragility of the human spirit. It is the story of a beacon extinguished at the very moment it was meant to shine its brightest, and the subsequent crumbling of the very structure that was built to house the light. The finality of the court's judgment did not bring closure. It merely codified the ending of a story that, by all rights, should have continued to unfold for decades, enriching the cultural landscape of the Pacific. The resilience of the human spirit in the wake of such profound devastation is perhaps the most unexpected element of this entire saga. Where one might have anticipated a permanent fracturing of the community, there is instead a slow, painful process of knitting together. The people of American Samoa, having been forced to stare directly into the abyss, have emerged with a renewed, almost fierce commitment to the values of their culture, the Fa Samoa that prioritizes the collective well-being, the importance of lineage, and the sanctity of the familial bond. They have taken the grief caused by the murder and transformed it into a quiet, steadfast dedication to the preservation of their heritage. The literature of the professor is read now with a greater intensity, her words dissected and cherished not just for their intellectual brilliance, but as artifacts of a woman who is a foundational architect of their modern identity. Every poem she wrote is now a small, defiant stand against the silence of her death, a lingering assertion of her presence that transcends the violence of her end. This tragedy has also prompted a necessary, if uncomfortable, revolution in how the community perceives the intersection of creative brilliance and mental vulnerability. There is a newfound willingness to acknowledge that the pursuit of excellence, particularly in the arts, carries with it an immense psychological toll that can no longer be ignored or treated with silent sympathy. The downfall of Figiel is a stark reminder that even those who appear most capable of articulating the deepest truths of the human experience can be the least equipped to manage their own inner chaos. The community has begun to foster a culture where the need for support, counseling, and genuine, non-judgmental human connection is seen as a sign of strength rather than weakness. This shift in perspective is the most tangible, lasting tribute to the memory of the professor. It is the realization that the protection of the human vessel is just as important as the cultivation of the human intellect. If the loss of such a brilliant mind can serve to save even one other person from the quiet, agonizing descent into madness, then the legacy of this tragedy takes on a different, more redemptive quality, one that looks toward a future characterized by a deeper, more profound sense of collective responsibility. The role of the mentor, a role Caroline Sinaviana Gabbard embodied with such grace, is now held in an even more sacred regard. The tragedy has highlighted the immense, often invisible power that mentors wield over the lives of their protégés and the reciprocal duty of care that must exist between them. It is a relationship defined by a unique, almost parental responsibility, where the guidance provided is intended to empower and elevate. When that bond is violated, the impact is not merely personal, it is a rupture that echoes throughout the entire community. The Islanders have come to understand that their cultural survival depends on the strength and the integrity of these intergenerational connections. By honoring the professor's role as a mentor, they are effectively safeguarding the future of their own cultural narrative, ensuring that the wisdom of the past is passed on to the next generation in an environment that is grounded in empathy, safety, and mutual respect. The visual presence of the island itself, the lush, green hills, the vast, rhythmic expanse of the Pacific Ocean, and the enduring quiet of the villages, now holds a different resonance for those who live there. The tragedy has added a layer of complexity to their relationship with their home, reminding them that even in the most serene and beautiful settings, the potential for profound sorrow exists. It is a humbling realization, one that fosters a deeper appreciation for the moments of peace and the connections that define their daily lives. The story of Caroline and Sia is not a blight on the beauty of American Samoa. Rather, it is a testament to the fact that their culture is mature enough and resilient enough to hold both the brilliance of their achievements and the darkness of their failures. They are not hiding the past, they are incorporating it into their current reality, building a future that is informed by the totality of their experiences, both the triumphant and the catastrophic. As we look toward the future, the name of Professor Caroline Sinaviana Gabbard will continue to be associated with the pioneering spirit of Pacific literature. She is, and will remain, an immortal figure in the history of the island, a woman whose life was defined by the barriers she broke and the voices she empowered. The tragedy that took her life cannot diminish the scope of her contributions, nor can it erase the profound influence she had on the lives of those she mentored. Her story is one of a life lived with immense purpose, a life that served as a light for so many, and even in the wake of her tragic passing, that light continues to guide the way for a people who are committed to continuing her work. The silence that once seemed so absolute in the wake of her death is now filled with the stories of her life, the lessons of her teaching, and the enduring, irrepressible power of her words. The legal process, the public shock, and the long, weary journey toward communal healing have all led to this moment of reflection, a moment that invites us to look at the fragility of life and the immense power of human empathy. We are left with the undeniable truth that the loss of an irreplaceable soul creates a void that can never be truly filled, but the effort to understand, to grieve, and to grow in the wake of that loss is what defines us as a people. The tragedy in Tafuna has left its mark, a deep, permanent scar, but it has also catalyzed a movement toward a more aware, more connected, and more compassionate future. It is the story of a community that found the courage to look at the darkness, to acknowledge the weight of their sorrow, and to eventually find the strength to continue the work of creating, of teaching, and of loving, all in the shadow of a sacrifice that will never be forgotten. In the end, this chronicle is a testament to the persistence of the human spirit. It is an acknowledgement that while we cannot prevent the tragedies that befall us, we can choose how we carry them and how we allow them to shape the architecture of our future. The legacy of Professor Caroline Sinaviana-Gabbard is secure, protected not just by the institution she served, but by the hearts and minds of the people who continue to walk the path she so courageously blazed. Her life, in all its complexity, its beauty, and its ultimate, heartbreaking end, remains a guiding star for the people of American Samoa, a reminder that every story matters, every voice is significant, and every life is a testament to the enduring, irrepressible power of the human capacity to dream, to create, and to reach out to one another in the hope of building a better, brighter, and more understanding world. The silence of the theater has been replaced by the enduring, resonant chorus of those who continue to tell her story, a promise that while her life was cut short, the impact of her spirit will remain an eternal, guiding light in the cultural history of the Pacific, forever echoing in the wind, the waves, and the very soul of the islands she so dearly loved. The conclusion of this investigation into the tragedy at the Galamoana Theater brings us to a space of quiet contemplation, where the noise of legal filings and the chaos of the immediate aftermath finally yield to the heavy, solemn reality of what has been lost. We have journeyed through the details of a life defined by pioneering brilliance and the subsequent, shattering collapse of an intimate bond that should have been the anchor of a cultural movement. This narrative, while rooted in the specific, localized geography of American Samoa, speaks to a broader, universal struggle to reconcile the brilliance of the human mind with the unpredictable and at times terrifying fragility of the human heart. To look back at the life of Professor Caroline Sinaviana-Gabbard is to engage with the absolute necessity of honoring those who clear the path for others. Her legacy is not merely the sum of her academic titles or the accolades that adorned her career. It is the living, breathing influence she exerted on every student who stood in her classroom and every reader who found a piece of their own identity reflected in her poetry. She was, in the most authentic sense, a builder of worlds, and the tragedy of her death lies in the fact that her work, while enduring, was forced into an premature silence by an act of violence that serves as a jarring antithesis to everything she stood for. To confront the actions of Papalii Sia is to accept the uncomfortable, often suppressed reality that brilliance is not an inoculation against darkness. The internal trajectory of her life, from the celebrated heights of the Commonwealth Writers' Prize to the depths of the crime she committed, is a haunting reminder that we are all, to some degree, custodians of our own psychological stability. There is no comfort in attempting to dissect the why of her actions, as there is no single, reductive explanation that could ever satisfy the scale of the destruction. Instead, we are left to observe the tragic erosion of her potential, noting how the pressures of her own creative process and the unaddressed complexities of her mental health became a corrosive force. The story of Figil is a sobering lesson on the necessity of communal vigilance, a reminder that the most creative among us are often those most in need of a robust, compassionate safety net. Her imprisonment is the only appropriate legal response to the irreversible harm she caused, yet it is also a quiet, sad footnote to a life that once held such immense, vibrant promise. The theater itself, that silent, cavernous space in Tafuna, now exists as a phantom in the village, a building that continues to hold the heavy memory of May 25th. It is a testament to the fact that physical structures are imbued with the weight of the events that occur within them. For the community, the task of reclamation is not about erasing the memory, but about transforming the space into something that can eventually host the light again, without forgetting the darkness that once occupied it. This is a delicate, long-term endeavor, one that requires a collective courage and a willingness to confront the past rather than retreat from it. The islanders have shown, through their measured, dignified response, that they possess the inner strength to carry this burden. They have chosen to remember the professor in the vibrant, thriving language of their ongoing cultural projects, ensuring that her spirit is not trapped in the trauma of her final moments, but is instead liberated through the ongoing practice of the traditions she fought so hard to preserve. As we step away from this account, it is vital to emphasize that the true measure of this tragedy is not found in the gore of the crime scene or the sterile environment of the courtroom, but in the enduring, echoing presence of the victim. Caroline Sinaviana-Gabbard continues to inhabit the intellectual and cultural life of American Samoa. Her voice, preserved in her written works, remains a powerful instrument of guidance, challenging her successors to continue the work of self-definition and cultural articulation. Her life serves as a blueprint for those who seek to navigate the complexities of identity in a rapidly changing world, and her death, as painful as it is, has only solidified her status as an ancestral figure, a guiding star for those who continue to navigate the currents of Pacific literature. She is no longer just a person. She is a concept, a symbol of the profound, irreplaceable importance of the mentor, the pioneer, and the storyteller. The broader implications of this tragedy for the Pacific Island community and for the global literary sphere are significant and far-reaching. It has opened a space for a necessary, overdue dialogue regarding the mental health of artists and the systemic pressures of the academic and creative worlds. This is a conversation that must continue, moving beyond the immediate aftermath of the tragedy into the long-term work of building structures that provide genuine, accessible, and destigmatized support for those who carry the burden of the creative spirit. The loss of such a life is a profound incentive for reform, for the creation of environments that prioritize human well-being, acknowledging that the most profound artistic contributions are born from a state of psychological health and security. The tragedy has effectively raised the stakes for every institution that supports the arts, demanding a more proactive and empathetic approach to the stewardship of their creative populations. In the final assessment, the story of Professor Caroline and Sia Figiel remains a complex, deeply woven tragedy of human connection. It is a story about the profound beauty of friendship and the terrifying potential for that friendship to be corrupted by the hidden, unmanaged shadows of the mind. It is a reminder that we exist in a precarious balance, tethered to one another by bonds of trust that must be maintained with care, vigilance, and a deep, ongoing commitment to empathy. The tragedy has left a scar on the history of American Samoa, but it has not broken the spirit of the people. They continue to thrive, to create, and to honor the memory of the professor in ways that are both significant and lasting. Their resilience is the true conclusion to this story, a testament to the capacity for a community to move through the deepest of sorrows and emerge with a renewed, more profound understanding of their own worth and their collective duty to protect the light of their shared history. The final words of this narrative should belong to the spirit of the professor herself, whose life's work was always focused on the elevation of the human condition and the celebration of the Pacific experience. As the community continues to find its way forward, her legacy serves as a constant, quiet encouragement to stay the course, to keep the stories alive, and to never allow the darkness of a single, horrific night to obscure the brightness of the sun that rises over the islands every day. The work continues. The poems are still being written, the students are still learning, and the culture continues to evolve, shaped by the memory of a woman who taught them that their stories were not just worth telling, but were, in fact, essential to the broader, unfolding narrative of humanity. This is the ultimate, redemptive victory of her life over the tragedy of her end, that the work continues, that the light remains, and that the history of the Pacific, in all its complexity and beauty, is being written by those who carry the torch she lit so many years ago. The silence of the theater may remain for a time, but it is not the sound of an ending. It is the quiet, expectant pause of a community that is gathering its strength, honoring its elders, and preparing to step into the future with a newfound, essential awareness of the profound, unbreakable value of the life they share. The tragedy is part of their history, but it is not the whole of their identity, and in that realization, they have found the path to a future that, despite the heavy price that has been paid, is irrevocably, defiantly their own. The professor's spirit endures, not just in the records of her career, but in the living pulse of the islands, a constant, guiding presence that will continue to inspire generations, ensuring that her life and her purpose are permanently etched into the heart of the Pacific, safe from the darkness, and forever moving toward the light of a new, enduring day. As we conclude this long and sorrowful exploration into the events of May 2024, we find ourselves standing at the confluence of memory, trauma, and the enduring human desire to find meaning in the wake of inexplicable loss. The story of Professor Caroline Sinaviana-Gabbard and Papalii Sia Figil serves as a profound meditation on the cyclical nature of mentorship and the devastating consequences that occur when the protective bonds of such a relationship are severed by an act of irreversible violence. Throughout these chapters, we have carefully parsed the details of a case that has left an indelible mark on American Samoa, not merely because of the prominence of the individuals involved, but because of what their tragedy signifies for a community that prides itself on deep-rooted, ancestral connections. We have looked at the victim not just as a statistic of crime, but as a towering figure of intellectual integrity, a woman who broke ground where none had dared to tread, and who provided the foundational narratives that allow for a modern understanding of Pacific identity. We have also examined the perpetrator, not to humanize the atrocities she committed, but to understand the terrifying erosion of the human mind, observing the descent of a creative genius into a landscape of isolation and lethal instability. This inquiry has been, above all, an attempt to provide a narrative container for a tragedy that, by its very nature, overflows the boundaries of logic and comfort. The legacy of the professor is now irrevocably intertwined with the circumstances of her passing, a reality that the community continues to balance with the vital, ongoing need to preserve the purity of her artistic and academic contributions. It is a dual burden, to acknowledge the visceral, brutal nature of her death, while simultaneously ensuring that this event does not come to eclipse the 77 years of life that preceded it. This is the struggle of the survivor, the task of the historian, and the responsibility of the community. They have chosen to navigate this through the institutionalization of her memory, through the creation of archives, scholarships, and public forums that keep her voice alive as an active, guiding presence rather than a fossilized relic of a tragic past. In doing so, they are performing an essential act of reclamation, asserting that the life she lived and the values she championed are stronger than the shadows that were cast in her final moments. This commitment is a beacon of hope in the darkness, a way of signaling to the world that while the island has been deeply wounded, it is not broken. Furthermore, we must reflect on the broader lessons that have been extracted from this nightmare, lessons that are, unfortunately, often written in the blood of the innocent. The tragedy has catalyzed a regional re-examination of the support systems that exist for the creative class, sparking a conversation about the necessity of integrating mental health awareness into the very infrastructure of academic and artistic life. It has moved the needle on how communities treat their pioneers, highlighting the reality that those who give the most of themselves in the service of their culture are often the most susceptible to the draining, isolating pressures of their public roles. If the story of the Galamoana Theater serves any future purpose, it is as a silent, powerful warning, a call for a more holistic approach to community care, one that recognizes the individual as an integrated whole, subject to the same vulnerabilities as any other human, regardless of their prestige or their creative output. The shift toward a more proactive, empathetic model of community support is the most significant, tangible outcome of this dark period, a sign that the community is not merely enduring its trauma, but is actively learning from it. The psychological footprint of this case will undoubtedly remain for a generation, as the islanders continue to integrate the reality of what occurred into their daily rhythms. For the family, the healing process is a private, infinite journey, one that is punctuated by the anniversaries of the tragedy and the ongoing efforts to keep the professor's name synonymous with excellence and compassion. Their grace has been the moral compass of the island, and their ability to endure has inspired a deeper, more resilient communal ethos. As for the legal resolution of the case, the life sentence handed down to Sia Figil stands as a cold, static marker of the state's obligation to deliver justice. It is the end of the public legal process, but it is also the beginning of a lifetime of confinement for a woman whose name will forever be associated with the destruction of her greatest ally. The finality of this legal state of affairs provides a necessary boundary, allowing the community to step back from the immediacy of the court's proceedings and engage with the deeper, more complex, and less resolvable questions of human frailty and the capacity for darkness. In reflecting on the literature that emerged from this period, one cannot help but notice the shift in tone and perspective among the writers who have stepped into the space left behind by the two women. There is a newfound focus on the interiority of the Pacific experience and increased attention to the nuances of trauma, healing, and the complexity of intergenerational relations. The tragedy has effectively accelerated a maturity in the regional literary voice, pushing it away from the surface-level celebration of culture toward a more sophisticated, honest, and courageous exploration of the challenges that attend the modern island experience. This is perhaps the most profound way in which the professor's influence continues to live on, not just through her own words, but through the ways in which her death has shaped the words of those who have picked up her pen. The work is continuing, and it is doing so with a gravity and a depth that honors the complexity of the life she led. We must also consider the role of silence in the aftermath of such an event, a silence that is not merely the absence of sound, but a heavy, reflective space that allows for the processing of grief. In the village of Tafuna, in the classrooms of the universities, and in the quiet homes where stories of the professor are recounted, this silence has become a constructive force. It is in this silence that the community finds a capacity to articulate their own grief, to frame their understanding of the event, and to eventually find the language to move forward. The silence of the theater, which was once so haunting, has been filled with the murmurs of a people who are no longer afraid to acknowledge the shadows in their midst. They have reclaimed the narrative, transforming it from a story of victimization into a story of collective resilience, a process that is essentially and uniquely their own. As we bring this account to its final close, we are reminded that the story of Professor Caroline Sinaviana Gabbard is one of immense, transformative purpose, a story that remains, despite the circumstances of its end, a testament to the life-giving power of the intellect and the enduring, irrepressible force of the human spirit. The tragedy is a profound, indelible chapter, but it is not the final chapter of her influence. The people of American Samoa, by their courage and their commitment to one another, are continuing to write the story of their own history, a history that is enriched by her memory and forever mindful of the fragility of the peace they work so hard to maintain. The final image we are left with is not of the crime scene, but of the morning light on the Pacific, a horizon that remains wide, promising, and filled with the possibility of new stories, new voices, and the continued, courageous pursuit of truth. The professor's spirit persists, a guiding light that continues to influence the cultural landscape, ensuring that the legacy she built remains a vibrant, living entity in the hearts of those who carry her memory forward. The tragedy of the Galamoana Theater is now a permanent part of the island's foundation, not as a point of weakness, but as a site of profound lesson, serving as a reminder that the bonds of community, when forged in the crucible of tragedy and tempered by the grace of remembrance, can become a force of unparalleled strength. We leave the story here, in the quiet, reflective space of a community that is at peace with its own history, forever grateful for the brilliance that was once among them, and forever committed to the preservation of the light that continues to shine in the wake of the darkest of nights. The professor's work is done, but the influence of her life has just begun to take on the character of an ancestor, a source of wisdom and strength that will provide comfort and clarity for the people of the Pacific for generations to come, ensuring that her memory is never a casualty of the violence that sought to end her, but rather the cornerstone of a new, more aware, and more profoundly connected future. The finality of this account brings us to a place of profound stillness, where the tumultuous waves of emotion and the stark, uncompromising facts of the case eventually settle into the quiet bedrock of communal history. To reflect on the life and death of Professor Caroline Sinaviana Gabbard is to engage with the very essence of what it means to build a legacy that transcends the temporal boundaries of a single lifetime. Her existence was a testament to the transformative power of the intellect, a lifelong commitment to the idea that the narratives of the Pacific were not mere peripheral subjects but were, in fact, central to the broader, unfolding human story. As the village of Tafuna moves forward, the memory of her contributions serves as a vital, persistent thread in the tapestry of American Samoa, a thread that remains unbroken despite the savage, inexplicable violence that attempted to sever it. The story of her life, and the tragedy of its end, have now been woven into the cultural identity of her people, transforming her from a beloved mentor into an ancestral figure whose voice continues to guide, challenge, and inspire those who walk in her footsteps. The broader lesson of this narrative, which we have explored through the lens of legal records, witness testimonies, and the somber reflections of a mourning community, is the recognition of our shared, fundamental vulnerability. We exist in a world where the most profound bonds of trust can be obliterated by the unseen, unmanaged shadows of the human psyche, and where the most significant contributions to our shared culture can be silenced in a single, devastating moment. This is a reality that demands a new level of vigilance, not just in the security of our physical spaces, but in the attention we pay to one another. The tragedy at the Galamoana Theater stands as a stark, irrevocable reminder that the health of our community is contingent upon our ability to see one another, to acknowledge the weight of our mutual burdens, and to provide the support that is necessary for the preservation of our brightest and most sensitive minds. It is a call to action that resonates beyond the shores of American Samoa, a message to every academic, creative, and professional community about the imperative of empathy and the necessity of proactive communal care. As the legal chapter of this story remains sealed with the finality of a life sentence, the emotional work of the community continues in a mode of quiet, deliberate endurance. The process of reconciliation, not with the perpetrator, but with the reality of the crime itself, has been a slow and transformative endeavor. It has required the people to confront the darkness within their own borders, to name the horror for what it was, and then to consciously choose the light of their shared values as the path forward. This choice, made daily in the classrooms where the professor's influence is celebrated and in the homes where her poetry is recited, is the ultimate act of defiance against the destruction of her life. It is the assertion that while her physical presence has been stolen, the substance of her spirit is indestructible, a force that continues to shape the cultural geography of the island in ways that are both significant and lasting. The role of the arts in the wake of such a tragedy has been particularly poignant, as those who are influenced by both the professor and the playwright find themselves navigating a complex landscape of loss and creative responsibility. There is a deep, internal dialogue occurring within the literary circles of the Pacific, a grappling with the fact that art is often born from the very intensities that can become destructive if left untethered. This awareness has fostered a more grounded, honest, and courageous approach to the creative process, one that does not shy away from the darker corners of human experience, but approaches them with a necessary level of caution, support, and profound human compassion. The work that is now emerging from this period is characterized by a maturity that is the direct result of the crucible of grief, a sign that the community is not merely documenting its pain, but is transmuting it into a new, more profound, and more nuanced form of cultural expression. In the final assessment, the tragedy of the Galamoana Theater is now a permanent, somber marker in the chronicle of the Pacific, a story that demands to be handled with the utmost respect for the victim and a commitment to the truth of what transpired. It is a story that refuses to be simplified, resisting any attempt to reduce it to a mere moralizing parable. Instead, it stands as a complex, multifaceted reality that invites us to look deeply at the intersections of power, mentorship, creativity, and mental health. It is a story about the profound, irreplaceable value of the individuals we lose and the enduring, irrepressible power of the values they stood for. The professor's spirit endures, not just in the records of her career, but in the living pulse of the islands, a constant, guiding presence that will continue to inspire generations, ensuring that her life and her purpose are permanently etched into the heart of the Pacific. As the years pass, the specific details of the crime will begin to fade, replaced by the broader, more significant legacy of the life she led. This is the natural progression of history, where the intensity of the trauma eventually gives way to the enduring influence of the person. The professor's name will be remembered for the brilliance of her academic contributions and the compassion of her teaching, while the tragedy of her death will serve as a quiet, sobering background to the vibrancy of her memory. This is a fitting and necessary evolution, one that restores the focus to the things that truly matter, the wisdom, the beauty, and the profound, transformative influence of a life that was dedicated to the service of others. The island of American Samoa is better for having had her, and it is stronger for having endured the loss of her, emerging from the darkness with a renewed, essential awareness of the profound, unbreakable value of the life they share. The story we have chronicled is one that touches the very core of what it means to be human, the capacity for both immense, light-filled creation and the depths of unfathomable, destructive darkness. It is a story that leaves us with more questions than answers, and in those questions, we find the impetus for our own continued growth and reflection. We are left to ponder the fragility of our connections, the importance of our mentors, and the imperative of cultivating a community that is capable of holding both our triumphs and our failures with a sense of collective purpose and grace. The professor's work is done, but the influence of her life is taken on the character of an ancestor, a source of wisdom and strength that will provide comfort and clarity for the people of the Pacific for generations to come, ensuring that her memory is never a casualty of the violence that sought to end her, but rather the cornerstone of a new, more aware, and more profoundly connected future. This account, therefore, serves as the final, formal record of a period of immense sorrow and subsequent, courageous recovery. It stands as a tribute to Professor Caroline Sinaviana Gabbard, honoring the dignity of her life and the absolute, undeniable significance of her voice. It also stands as a reflection on the dark, complex reality of the events that transpired in the Galamoana Theater, acknowledging the depth of the tragedy while refusing to be defined by it. The island continues. The ocean remains a constant, rhythmic presence, and the stories, the ones she taught, the ones she wrote, and the ones she inspired others to tell, are the living, breathing reality of a culture that is moving forward, forever changed, but forever anchored by the light of the history she helped to illuminate. The silence of the theater has been replaced by the enduring, resonant chorus of those who continue to tell her story, a promise that while her life was cut short, the impact of her spirit will remain an eternal, guiding light in the cultural history of the Pacific, forever echoing in the wind, the waves, and the very soul of the islands she so dearly loved. The memory of the professor is thus secured in the most enduring of all places, the collective, resilient heart of a community that has looked into the darkness, acknowledged the pain of its loss, and chose, in the face of all things, to continue the work of creating, of teaching, and of loving, a commitment that serves as the ultimate, living monument to a life that continues to inspire long after the final chapter has been written, ensuring that the light of her influence will remain an unextinguishable, guiding presence in the ongoing, vibrant, and deeply meaningful history of the Pacific.